the political geography now is just radically changed. Keir Starmer has a mandate, but for what precisely? Radical reform is required, but given that he wasn't open about and transparent with the public in the same way that Blair was, I think he's going to find it slightly trickier.
That is politicians failing in one of their core duties, actually, which is to put the country first and to put good policy first, and just instead to keep pursuing these narrow factional interests.
We've had so much about it. We need to tack to the left on economics. It seems Reform have done very well not tacking to the left on economics.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast with me, Tom Clougherty, my co-host Matthew Lesh, and joining us on the podcast this week, Dr. Michael Turner, a pollster, strategist and fellow at the Adam Smith Institute. Michael has worked on election campaigns across the English-speaking world, including for the UK Labour Party. He's a director at Freshwater Strategy, and he is, I think, the perfect person to join us on the podcast this week, given that we're talking about the UK's general election, which just happened last night, if you see any tired eyes in this room. Matthew.
Well, good, happy election day, Tom. It's never been a more exciting time. So, at the time of recording, Labour has been victorious in 412 constituencies, and that's giving them a majority of over 170 seats. That's significantly higher than Boris's majority in 2019 of 80. I suppose the question we now need to think about first, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on, Mike, how good a night is this for Labour? How do we rate this?
Yeah, well, it's certainly good on paper. Those figures are remarkable, and Keir Starmer will be happy that he's got quite a convincing majority. But I think if you scratch the surface beneath some of those results, you'll find that it's pretty wide but shallow success for Keir Starmer's Labour Party. I believe that if there were fewer insurgent parties like Reform and what have you, then the Conservatives would have done less badly. And this is certainly, in my view, more of a reflection of the rejection of the Conservatives in the UK. 14 years is a fairly long time to be in government, and obviously there was a bit of chaos towards the end of that administration, which is reflected in some of those results. We've seen some people roll out of government who have had senior positions within the Conservative administration over time. Grant Shapps, Liz Truss, Theresa Coffey, Jacob Rees-Mogg had his own Michael Portillo moment last night. So, yes, I think it's more of a rejection of the Conservatives than it is an endorsement of Keir Starmer. We also need to remember that Keir Starmer is an unpopular leader, quite literally. He has a net negative favourability. He's walking to Downing Street, unpopular with the electorate. Actually less popular than Liz Truss was when she walked into Downing Street as well. That's probably going to change because there is a bit of a winner's bonus when you do step into Downing Street. But he'll have a challenge on his hands. The public is expecting of change, and he needs to deliver that fairly fast, otherwise the cricket bats will be out, as you say.
Yeah, this seems like quite an extraordinary result in many ways. In the first instance, I think it's just so important to emphasise that this is huge for Labour. They win government so rarely. It is, the second person in 50 years. The only one who's really got this has been Tony Blair. And they have a really big majority, admittedly not as big as 97. At the same time, though, Tom, they also have the lowest vote share for any victorious government since 1945. It's a really low primary vote going on here.
Yeah, I do think that is quite striking, actually, especially when you take into consideration all of the polls that we all saw in the run-up to this election. You can't argue with the size of that majority and the fact that it's an enormous victory, and it will give them, in our parliamentary system, enormous power to pursue the policies they want to pursue over the next few years. Of course, we can talk about where we think that will go and how successful they might be and what problems they might run into. But nonetheless, it is striking that they got about 34% of the popular vote. And this was a low turnout election. I think they're talking about it being about 60% overall turnout, which is better than 2001. But by historical standards, that's pretty low. So you have a government with a huge majority, an enormous amount of power, but actually only about 20% of those who are registered to vote have cast their vote for them. And that probably does store up some problems down the track. I think one of the things that we maybe have to become used to is we've had this idea in the past that if a government wins or a political party wins a big election victory, that they can probably coast to a second term in office. I mean, I can well remember people saying that on that December night in 2019, where Boris Johnson and the Conservatives won their 80-seat majority, people were saying, Labour will be out of power for another 10 or 15 years. Actually, politics has become incredibly volatile. I think people's traditional ties to parties have kind of broken. And so you can get these massive changes. What I think will be interesting from a policy perspective is how much are those massive changes in the makeup of Parliament actually reflected in very different directions for policy and for the direction of the country. And that, I think, very much remains to be seen.
Let's come back to that in a second. I'm keen to get your thoughts, Mike, on why perhaps some of the pollsters, I think pretty much all the pollsters, perhaps overestimated Labour's vote share. Did they, in the end, face a problem with turnout, that their voters just thought they were going to win, so they didn't bother turning out? Did the Tory warnings about a supermajority end up being effective? What do you think explains the difference on election day?
Yeah, turnout in the UK is a pollster's nightmare. You're having to be able to forecast an event, an action that's going to take place in the future, and people are really bad at forecasting their future events. They say they're going to go to the gym and they don't. They say they're going to die and they don't. They say they're going to vote and many of them don't. And naturally, most people would feel that their vote would count for less in an environment where Labour are forecast to win anyway. There's a text message from a mate saying come to the pub instead of going to the ballot box instead. These sorts of things happen. So I think certainly it will be turnout estimation. The strength of Labour's support was certainly there. I would also say as well, the exit poll didn't have an excellent night either. It severely overestimated Reform's estimated number of seats. There was a bit of a wobble also at some point with the SNP, and it underestimated the Greens as well in the evening. But broadly speaking, declaring here as well that I am a pollster. I think the pollsters had a reasonably good night. The most important thing is calling the outcome, and that they were reasonably accurate on the overall strength of the outcome. There's a spectrum there across the industry, which is fairly healthy, but the average of that spectrum was broadly there. The one thing I would say is that the political geography now is just radically changed. I mean, Reform are the second place party in many, many seats up and down the country, particularly in the northeast and on that east coast. And with Farage in the chamber, I'm fully expecting him to be using that as a campaigning platform for the next 5 years to effectively be the unofficial opposition, Trump's envoy in Westminster. To kind of use it as an ability to expand his base. We have a saying when we're advising political parties ahead of elections to just land and expand. It's pretty clear that Keir Starmer was ming-varsing it. He was trying not to make any mistakes because the polling was in his favour, and so he will certainly be holding back a little bit about his personality and his agenda. And I think that's a massive problem if you look at the problems that the Albanese government's facing in Australia. Having had a relatively thin agenda going into that election, and ultimately going off that with the voice referendum. Keir Starmer has a mandate, but for what precisely? And radical reform is required, but given that he wasn't open about and transparent with the public in the same way that Blair was, I think he's going to find it slightly trickier trying to negotiate many of the challenges he faced in the next couple of years.
Tom, what do you think the implications are going to be for Labour's policy agenda from the last 24 hours? I mean, it seemed like Labour was already intending this kind of small target strategy, not wanting to overpromise and therefore under-deliver. At the same time, though, they've won a big majority. Will they use that perhaps, something that we talk about a lot, doing planning reform or taking another look at the NHS? Will they be, quietly radical in some ways, despite perhaps being, you would think they would hopefully be aware that they have a limited mandate to be radical in some other ways?
Yeah, I think the thing that I would really give the Labour Party credit for, well, partly it's for purging that sort of very socialist Corbynite element from the party, but that as a prelude to basically making growth one of their main focuses and one of their main priorities, and talking, in quite robust terms about needing to get the economy growing before they could achieve any of their other sort of social justice objectives. But of course, that's difficult. If it was easy, every government would do it. And there are trade-offs and there are political sacrifices you have to be willing to make. So I think if you look at the big things that maybe we hope Labour could do. I mean, it all comes down to getting Britain building and try to liberalise the planning system, get us more housing and more factories and more labs and more roads and everything else, and energy infrastructure for that matter as well is going to be very important. But that's easy to talk about in opposition. We've seen repeatedly in recent British history, or even not that recent, that it's quite hard to deliver in practice. And I think the point that Mike makes, that this wasn't as explicit as it could have been, but because this was, in a sense, an easy election campaign for Labour, they weren't forced to go out there and really make the case for the kind of policies they wanted to implement. They were trying to present a small target. They were trying to play it safe and win by default. And that's pretty much what has happened. So you do wonder, when you have that many MPs, and some of them have quite slim majorities, how committed are they going to be to the tough choices that need to be made? And so there's partly a political problem, but I also do worry on some of this housing stuff and planning stuff generally, that Labour haven't really grasped, and no one has really grasped actually what needs to be done. So it's fine to talk about new towns, right? It's going to be extremely difficult to get a new town built in the next 5 years, let alone the next 10 years, even if you have a following wind on the planning system.
And even if new towns are the solution, which they...
Even if they're solution, which they probably aren't, what you really need is kind of densification in London. You need urban extensions to places that really need to grow, like Oxford and Cambridge. So I think there's a danger they sort of pursue the wrong things, they crumble at the opposition to them. And we have, in a sense, a continuation of this kind of lackluster, going nowhere kind of government that we've had for the last few years. And the sense that Keir Starmer isn't entering Downing Street with that huge wave of kind of Blairite enthusiasm behind him maybe makes that an even more real prospect.
So, Mike, the other kind of interesting element from the result, and I might want to continue on some of that discussion as well, but there's a few parts that really stuck out to me. First one was the very big swing against Labour in constituencies with a high Muslim vote, and the loss of former Labour MP Jonathan Ashworth, who was meant to be a Secretary of State and be sitting in Cabinet. So they've got a bit of a threat there, and I think Albanese is seeing this in Australia as well, to do with the Gaza-Israel issue, and that changing electoral dynamics quite substantially, I would say. You've also then got the rise of the Greens as a potential kind of threat to the left. And then, and we hinted at this earlier, Labour also is seeing reform come number 2 in a lot of their seats, in a lot of their constituencies. So I suppose the question is, like, how does Labour balance all these kind of potentially competing electoral pressures that they're now under, especially in the knowledge that they haven't got a huge primary vote in this election? Yeah,
I think that's actually a problem that doesn't just affect the Labour Party. It's affected the Conservatives this time. The Americans call it double haters, right? So the rejection of both of the two mainstream parties. And in a first-past-the-post system where, when you do political science, you learn about Duverger's law, which is, majoritarian electoral systems, there's a penalty to going outside the two main competing parties. And so at the next election, people are encouraged, because of their wasted vote, to be able to go back to the main parties. It feels to me that the UK is, despite the problems and the challenges that third parties have to be able to get up and get a member of Parliament into Westminster, like Reform, like the Greens have traditionally had, and like the Liberal Democrats sometimes have as well. Voters are just rejecting established parties. I mean, I would characterise the shifts that we're seeing across the globe as a rejection of the establishment parties rather than a shift to the left or right. If you look at Europe, it's a rejection of who's in government. If you look at the UK, it's a rejection of who's in government. If you looked at the 2022 election in Australia, it was a rejection of the government. New Zealand, the same. Likely again in the US. It doesn't matter whether it's left or right. Left or right is becoming increasingly redundant. It's much more multidimensional, and it's more of that my lives aren't actually materially improving anymore, and we want to punish those that are in government, and we're willing to be able to go elsewhere to be able to do it. The challenges that Labour face are the same that the Conservatives face. They have contenders to the left of them, contenders to the right of them. But my advice to any political party would be that most voters are in the disinterested, non-political centre ground. And when you have a appealing platform to them, which is describing how you're going to improve their life, even in a way that has radical reform, then that's always a better platform to stand on. One thing I would say about Starmer's Labour Party is they could have had a convincing thumping majority even if they did go a little bit more wide, broad-shouldered with their policy agenda. I see no reason for them to try to attempt to be able to get a score in the sort of high 400s, and they could have had a sort of 380 seats, 390 seats, but revealed a lot more detail and found themselves in a much easier position moving forward. I think it was a bit of a folly to be so restrained. And the other thing I'd like to kind of respond to, the point that you made earlier on, was this point about it's positive that they're going for growth. I mean, for me, the idea that Labour is saying they're just going to grow their way out of it without like a bit of a cop out because they didn't want to say they're going to raise taxes for a lot of their plans ultimately, and actually if they wanted to show real restraint, which was the number one point on their manifesto, then they would have looked at where they're actually going to be cutting back properly, right? Because Lord knows that there are lots of areas that are kind of fairly bloated on the British economy right now.
I just get the sense this could really be quite a short honeymoon period for Keir Starmer. I think you're right that as we usually know, you get a bit of a bump. He gave a pretty decent speech in front of Number 10 not too long ago. But at the same time, it seems like he's on a very technocratic path. Like what he's talking about here is he just sees the state as poorly managed by the Tories, and all it needs is kind of new leadership rather than kind of deeper thinking about institutional reform, about public sector productivity, about competition. Like a lot of the things actually what the Blair government did in terms of the public sector and the NHS even, that ended up delivering much better outcomes. They don't seem to necessarily be thinking along those lines. They're thinking kind of much more narrowly. Perhaps the exception here is planning, and you can get a lot out of planning reform, but there's such a risk here that you come back in a year's time and life isn't that much better. The economy is still stagnant. They haven't necessarily managed to get through that radical planning reform because there's a lot of opposition on their backbenches, or there's inertia within the civil service. I can just see this actually becoming quite toxic for them surprisingly quickly.
I mean, I was struck. One of the weird things about this election campaign was how much of it revolved around people ruling things out, or one set of politicians challenging the other set to rule something out. And this is actually, I mean, obviously some of those things I wanted to be ruled out. But it's a very difficult way to do politics and to govern, where it basically, I think, shows that we're no closer at all to having any kind of what you might call elite bargain in this country, where politicians accept there are unpopular things that we need to do for our general economic benefit, and we won't be able to do them if you refuse to kind of just sort of stand off and let the other side get on with it when it's something that you think is good and that you agree with and that is for the good of the country. We're clearly not there. I mean, maybe you wouldn't expect that during a general election, but I don't think we're going to get it during a period of government either. And that is really worrying. I think to a certain extent, that is politicians failing in one of their core duties, actually, which is to put the country first and to put good policy first, and just instead to keep pursuing these narrow factional interests.
Well, I don't necessarily think that you have to go into an election just appeasing voters' immediate needs. I think that if you could string together a serious narrative which explains the rationale for doing so, and meld that with some things which show that you have their interests at heart, I think you can win them over. I mean, there are plenty of examples where initially unpopular issues and policies, the public have changed their mind on them over time, and I think that you can do that in an election campaign. I think the problem with this administration is that the Starmer led Labour Party was so desperate to be able to make sure that it didn't fail in getting elected, and to be able to let the left back in, that it would basically just do or say anything to be able to get back into power. And part of my thinking is that it's going to spend a decent amount of its thinking time over the next few years trying to purge some of the more activist elements of its party. It won't mind if it ends up kind of, at the end of the day, it could lose about 80 odd members of parliament, and it'll still be perfectly comfortable passing legislation to try and bring it even further to the centre ground, is my view. But I think it was a wasted opportunity. My concern about Keir Starmer is that he's not someone that can bring people with them, as Matthew quite rightly described. I think he's more of a technocrat. And he sort of believes that through the bureaucracy, making politics boring, they can sort of save politics again. And I disagree. I think all of the great changes and the great positive reforms that have happened in this country have been when you've had leaders that have had a pretty clear vision and been able to take people with them on that, to be able to kind of give themselves a mandate for serious change. Boris Johnson, Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher. They've all achieved a great deal in a short space of time by having a charismatic engagement, relatable engagement with the public and bringing them with them.
It is worth saying that this result is a disaster for Labour's left. It completely destroyed the Owen Jones worldview, which is that the Labour Party can win elections by tacking quite far to the left. It doesn't really work out, does it?
Yeah. Well, shall we switch to talking a little bit about the Conservative Party and the implications of this election result for them? Sam Ashworth-Hayes put it, I think, quite well in the Telegraph this morning, saying that the Tories have achieved a feat of negative triangulation, which is to say that they've managed to upset all the different potential voter groups simultaneously. Maybe some of their rhetoric and presentation has upset the centrists, and so they've lost ground to the Liberal Democrats. Equally, their failure to deliver on things like immigration or crime, whether I agree with what they're trying to deliver or not, that failure has absolutely infuriated the right. And you could probably sort of pick this through various different ways. But is that, do you think, a fair assessment of what's happened to the Conservatives at this election? That is, that they have lost votes in every direction simultaneously? Or is there a simpler story here?
Well, I don't think that's only a fair assessment, opinion. That is the data. Right. They suggest exactly that. I mean, they've lost it towards the left. They've lost it towards the right. They've actually lost it towards the on the globalist dimension, towards reform as well. Yeah, they have been hemorrhaging votes, in every direction, and that's clear because they've been inward. They've been looking inward. They've been thinking about leadership ambitions. They're directionless. They didn't have proper leadership within the party, basically since Boris Johnson was rolled in 2022. That's right.
It's been a long couple of years.
Yeah, it really has. 2022. And I think ever since then, they've been struggling to be able to decide which direction they should go. You've got Suella Braverman pulling him off to the right, and you've got the One Nation pulling him off to the centre ground. And the reality is that every party does better when it's united, and it clearly hasn't been.
Yeah. Well, that's something that's maybe almost unique in this election, right? That traditionally, the right in British politics has benefited from the fact that the left is somewhat split between Labour and the Liberal Democrats or other parties at various times that you can roll in there. Probably the reason that the Conservatives have been able to build this reputation as the natural party of government, the government that the party that you expect to win, on any given opportunity, is because the right has always been united in the UK. And now, it's split massively. I haven't actually seen the final vote shares or anything, but what the Tories are on about 24%, Reform are on, 16 or something? Is that right? Yeah. Thereabouts?
Yeah, I think it's about 15 and I think it's about 25 for the Conservatives. But I think you're totally right. I think valence is an underestimated sort of quality here now, right? So we talk about ideology, where do we lie on the political spectrums and dimensions. I think we overplay that. I think the reality is that personality counts for a lot. Right? If someone thinks that you're a good person that have their interest at heart, I think you're capable and that you can get things done, then they will consider you. And particularly this election, if you think about the Conservative voters, if they wanted to punch the Conservatives, they had three options this time. Option one was they could vote for the Labour Party. Option two was they could vote for Reform. Option three was they could stay at home. Quite clearly, a lot of them have stayed at home. So they were still not willing to be able to go to other political parties to be able to punish them. So there is a sort of shaft of light for the Conservatives that they can kind of come back in a relatively strong way at the next election if they can get themselves in order again to be seen as a party that is capable, once again, of running a government. And I think we've got to be honest in this room, they were not. This year, they were not. They were not running things very well, and the public quite clearly see this. So they would elect anyone but the Conservatives at this election, and that anyone obviously was Keir Starmer, and that's the way that people should interpret this election result. So for the Conservatives, they need to make a decision quick. My view is that the campaign, who were quite clearly caught off guard by Rishi Sunak's decision to be able to call this election, which I thought was an absolute blunder and quite disrespectful, I must say, of a lot of the backbenchers who were expecting there to be an autumn election, as he'd told them not long before. They could have chosen one path that could have been down on the blue wall, or to protect the red wall a bit more, which would have been a bit more of that kind of reform ilk. And they didn't choose either. Instead, what they said is, we're going to try to hold on to everything because the economy is improving. And people are just going to turn around, look at the economy, look at Rishi Sunak, look at the economy again and go, it's not stacking up.
Yeah.
What you're saying I'm not feeling it. So I just don't believe you. And this is the important thing that people don't understand is that you can have all the answers. Rishi Sunak's very smart. He's got all the answers. He's book smart, but he's not street smart. And he doesn't understand the rough and tumble of politics. And I don't think he really ever did. And I think the idea is you've got to be relatable to be able to understand that, to convince people to change their opinion on something, to be able to come around to your perspective. And he failed that task for most of his time in Parliament.
It is that classic question: do you feel better off today than you were 5 years ago? And the answer overwhelmingly is no. And that's because inflation has been so outrageously high that even if inflation is down to 2%, that doesn't mean that people's lost income and lost quality of life has gone away. Plus, on top of that, just the general questions around the quality of public services that the Tories, I suppose you can, in the first instance, you can say some of this is out of their control. So how much you blame the Tory party for COVID, for the pandemic, for the global cost of living crisis, I think you can a bit, because monetary policy is the reason why we've got inflation, and that's because Rishi, in fact, decided to spend a lot of money and borrow a lot of money, and then that fed through. So the kind of lower quality of life in that first instance is partly their fault, partly not their fault. Then you have the second issue, of course, here, which is just the quality of public services that a lot of people do care about. And the Tories have made a decision over 14 years to not reform those services in a meaningful way. They made a decision to and Boris did this, just despite all his capacity, is they made a short-term strategy to wrap themselves around the NHS, say the NHS is great, never question the orthodoxy, and then they've turned around and it's not performing well, but they've got nothing they can say about it because they've just said the NHS is so great and they haven't made an argument for reform. And you see that with the perhaps exception of education, where they were quite competent in reforming, you see that across all sorts of different public sector issues. So I think that's the primary issue of why people wanted to give them a bit of a kick. And then you add on top of that all the unforced errors during the campaign, the D-Day issue, which definitely helped reform quite significantly, the various scandals over the last 2 years, the instability. You add that all up, and they're in a really weak position. What's, I suppose, on the back of my mind is this. It's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place at the moment. As you've said, everyone is voting against them, perhaps for different reasons. So how do they, as a party, I suppose, get through the infighting stage, which I think probably in the short term should be vicious, and there's nothing wrong with a bit of infighting after election. You got to figure out what you're standing for. But then how do you build a broad enough coalition, considering pressures on all sorts of different ways? You've mentioned reform. People also, a lot of Tories went and voted Lib Dem, and can they win back those Lib Dem constituencies? Maybe they don't want to win back those Lib Dem constituencies. Maybe they want to try to go to the Midlands and North, or to, how broad does a coalition need to be successful?
And I suppose as a supplement to that, how much of it is actually about policy? I mean, here in this room and at the IEA and in think tank world in general, we want to think that everything is about policy. And so the natural thing is to say, this party lost because they weren't free market enough. But then other people are saying, well, no, this heralds the rise of post-liberalism, and you need a fundamentally different, more collectivist, communitarian, authoritarian sort of conservatism if you're going to win elections, and so on and so forth. But maybe what I read into your previous answer is that an awful lot of this is sort of personality and strategy and communication, and the policy is super important, but the two things aren't necessarily the same.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I certainly think policy is important. It's definitely good to be able to have a choice elections. I think that a lot of voters feel that there's less and less choice now between the two main parties, and that's part of the reason why they're going to other minor parties. But it's how you articulate that in a way which makes people understand the reasons why it's going to improve their life, and it'll also be believable. I think if the arguments for privatisation in this country at the moment, because many of the things that they consider to be privatised, even though they wouldn't be a totally free market, they don't feel they're very good right now. I don't think many things are working. So your ability to articulate the importance of taking a certain approach is extremely important. And you don't have to do too much of it. You just have to focus on a few important things. I think the inability of the Conservatives one of the things about Rishi Sunak was that he try as he might, he couldn't really relate that well to ordinary punter who was suffering with the rising cost of living, regardless of whose fault that was. And I think it's important that people are, if you look at the Albanese government in Australia, they've had 2 years where they've basically overseen sort of 12 interest rate rises, and they've not really done a huge amount to be able to kind of help people with the cost of living, but people are still willing to give him a go because they believe that he is the one that has their interests at heart, and he's just trying to do that, because when they look at him and what he's saying is that we're doing X, Y, and Z to be able to kind of help you, and we understand that you're doing it tough right now. In the UK, I just feel that Rishi Sunak had failed to properly articulate that, and he would have got a little bit more time, a little bit more wiggle room if he had.
I think something I'm quite interested in unpacking is the success of reform and what's driving that, and what kind of voter that they're pulling in. I think it's quite interesting here. Now, in my mind, the primary reason people voted for them was over immigration. The Tories, there's a set of people who think, maybe it's not necessarily a view shared widely at the IEA, but there are a lot of people who think immigration is a major problem. It certainly is creating a lot of pressures on public services, on housing. The Tories repeatedly promised that they would get down the numbers. They did the complete opposite. Record levels of immigration. It created a huge opening for reform. But what I also, I suppose, and on the cultural conservative side as well, the feeling that despite the Tories being in power, that country is becoming more culturally progressive, and a kind of a backlash, a rejection of that. You're seeing right across Europe, right across the world to some extent. But at the same time, Reform actually quite perhaps unique by European standards as a populist party, in the sense that they are actually a lot more free market leaning. They, compared to Le Pen's party, the National Front in France, who are quite socialist in their economics, they are largely, not entirely, but largely they talk about cutting taxes, about cutting regulation, as a kind of economic solution. Which
major NHS reforms were in that manifesto for whatever attention people paid, but they were in there.
Indeed. I suppose that raises the question in my mind. It's like, what is the populist offering? What is the successful populist offering? What is the successful coalition? Part of something for the Tories need to think about, something that Reform is offering. It doesn't seem to be. We had this kind of post-2019 narrative that a successful Boris administration to reach out to those red wall voters needed to really tack to the left. We've had so much about it. They really need to tack to the left on economics. It seems Reform have done very well not tacking to the left on economics. Yeah. And maybe that sort of tells us something very different about that constituency that was never appreciated.
And so I think that's a super interesting question. I think there's two parts to it. Number one is Reform are what I would call a radical right party. They are not extreme on many issues outside kind of immigration, I'd say. But they do have like a sort of a cross-cutting sort of policy platform where there's some things that are basically shipped to the centre right, there's some things that are shipped to the centre left, and it's sort of a hodgepodge collection of items. And I would put that in the basket of populist things that are generally speaking kind of like poll very well. People feel that will improve their lives right now. It's sort of a, please help me.
Cut taxes. Exactly. Everyone loves cutting taxes.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Cut taxes, improve your services, all these sorts of things, right? But ultimately it's a basket of things that people want to see happen, and they're just speaking to all the highlights of those, right? And knowing that they don't have to deal with any of them because they're not going to get government anytime soon. Mm-hmm. But also, I just think we need to remember this. Richard Tice wasn't doing exactly well for Reform, right, when he was leader. Reform only did well when Nigel Farage took over. And yet, I just want to reiterate this point about the cult personality. Tony Blair was loved and admired by his supporters. He worked over several years since he was elected leader, well ahead of the 1997 election, to kind of cultivate this view of himself as a reformer, as someone that people could trust to be able to kind of have his hands on the economy. Nigel Farage is a supreme campaigner. He's turned the European Parliament into a campaigning chamber for himself during his 20 years that he was in there. He stood on major single issues. He was very popular in "I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here." Right. He has a skill, a knack for running certain issues, and he radically transformed the electoral fortunes of reforms. He sort of turbocharged it the minute he took over. So yet again, it just goes to show that you need to marry that with popular individuals. I believe the same thing's happening with Front National. with the National Rally Party, as their names change. And yeah, at one time, Pauline Hanson was a relatively popular individual in Australia, One Nation Party, which is quite similar to Reform, and during the heydays of One Nation as well. So personality is also important, and it just goes back to what I'm saying about valence, which is that most people are not looking at the details of what the IEA is proposing for, on particular policies.
Yeah,
absolutely. Sure, other than us, obviously. And so the importance of being able to articulate that within a vision, which people can say, that person, he's going to make decisions the way I want them to be made, and I believe in them. And this is the important point also for the next leader of the Conservatives, which is that their reputation, their brand, is trash. It's in the toilet right now. So whoever they pick, there needs to be a departure, and there needs to be some sort of healing and reform process internally within the party, and some sort of learning before they can kind of come back and be increasingly sceptical and critical of the Starmer government. So what that's going to mean is the first couple of years for Starmer are almost going to be completely unchecked, right? Yeah, unchecked power, huge majority, while the Conservatives get themselves in some order again.
All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We could probably keep going for longer, but let's draw it to a close there. Mike, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your insights on the general election, which is, after all, only a few hours old at this point. I'm sure you probably would have preferred to go straight to bed after your night on the airwaves. But anyway, thank you, everyone, for listening and or watching. We'll be back again next week. In the meantime, you can find out far more about some of the policy issues we mentioned on the IEA website, iea.org.uk. And indeed, I'd encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Until next time, thank you.